The woods are on fire. Somewhere in the darkness, between the tangled vines, the twisted oaks, the undergrowth so thick a man can barely see 5 feet in front of him, men are screaming. Not the battle cry kind of screaming, something worse, something that will haunt every survivor of this battle for the rest of their lives. The wounded can't move. The smoke is too thick to see through. The fire doesn't care which uniform you're wearing. This is the wilderness. May 1864. And what is happening here is not war as anyone imagined it. This is something older, something primal, a nightmare dressed up in blue and gray. Before it's over, nearly 29,000 men will be killed, wounded, or go missing in 2 days. And when it ends, no one will be able to say who won. To understand the Battle of the Wilderness, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand how desperate the Union had become. It was the spring of 1864. The Civil War had been grinding for 3 years. 3 years of blood, stalemate, and heartbreak in the East. The Army of the Potomac, the Union's great eastern force, had marched and retreated, advanced and collapsed, under a parade of generals that Lincoln cycled through like a man trying every key on a ring, hoping one would finally open the door. Burnside, Hooker, McClellan, none of them could break Robert E. Lee. In February 1864, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as commander-in-chief of all Union armies. Grant was different. He had bled the Confederacy dry in the West, Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, Chattanooga. He was the first man to hold the rank of lieutenant general since George Washington. And he came with a promise, an iron, unconditional promise, that he would not stop, would not retreat, would not flinch. Lincoln had been waiting 3 years for this man. Grant's primary goal was to engage Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and keep it under relentless pressure, making it impossible for Lee to send reinforcements south to resist Sherman's advance into Georgia. 2 hammers, 2 fronts. Squeeze the Confederacy until it broke. The plan was elegant. What happened next was anything but. On May 4, 1864, Grant ordered 115,000 soldiers of the Army of the Potomac to cross the Rapidan River and march through a dense stretch of woodland known as the Wilderness. The Wilderness. Even the name was a warning. It was a tangled area of dense forest and undergrowth that had already hampered the Union at the Battle of Chancellorsville the year before. The trees were thick. The brush was chest-high in places. Roads disappeared into thickets. Artillery, the Union's great advantage, was nearly useless in terrain where you couldn't see 20 yards ahead. The forest swallowed armies whole. Grant knew this. His plan was simple: move fast, cross the Rapidan, punch through the Wilderness before Lee could react, and get into open ground where the Union's superior numbers could do their brutal work. Grant intended to push the army through the rough terrain into open ground as quickly as possible. He almost made it. Meanwhile, on a hilltop south of the river, Robert E. Lee had been watching. On May 2nd, Lee met with his senior officers atop Clark's Mountain and concluded from the activity in the federal camps that a major movement was coming. He even accurately predicted the exact points where Grant would cross the river. Lee knew what Grant didn't know he knew, and Lee had a plan of his own. Lee would let Grant's army enter the Wilderness, wait until the Union soldiers were disoriented and mired in the trees, and then attack with everything he had. In open ground, he was outnumbered nearly 2-1. In the Wilderness, those numbers meant nothing. The trap was set. On the morning of May 5th, as Union General Gouverneur Warren's corps advanced, word arrived that Confederate infantry was approaching from the west on the Orange Turnpike. Warren's men stepped into a small clearing called Saunders Field and walked straight into a wall of Confederate fire. The battle had begun. Not the orderly, calculated engagement Grant had planned. Something chaotic, terrifying, and utterly unlike any battle these men had fought before. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, as the trees and thick undergrowth made it nearly impossible to move in an orderly fashion, and negated the effect of both cavalry and artillery. Units lost contact with each other within minutes. Officers couldn't see their own men. Regiments charged and dissolved into the brush, emerging somewhere else entirely, sometimes behind their own lines, sometimes behind the enemy's. Men fought by sound, by muzzle flash in the dark, by guessing which direction the screaming was coming from. The battle was uncoordinated, bloody, and often confused. The wilderness had done exactly what Lee needed it to do, turned a numbers game into a knife fight in a dark room. And then the fires started. Small brush fires raged through the undergrowth, burning many wounded soldiers alive and filling the woods with smoke and ghastly cries. Men who had survived the bullets now faced something worse. The forest floor, dry leaves, brittle brush, years of dead wood, caught like tinder. Wounded men who couldn't move watched the flames creep toward them and had no choice but to scream. Grant's aide, Horace Porter, would later write that it seemed as though Christian men had turned to fiends and hell itself had usurped the place of earth. By the morning of May 6th, the Confederates were in serious trouble. On the southern flank, A.P. Hill's corps had been fighting all day and was on the verge of collapse. The Union's 2nd Corps, under the hard-driving Winfield Hancock, had pushed them back relentlessly. At 5 a.m. on May 6th, the Federals renewed their assault on Hill's corps, pushing the Confederates back, and Confederate collapse seemed imminent. Lee rode to the front himself. He tried to lead a countercharge personally, only to be physically restrained by his own soldiers who shouted, "Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear!" refusing to advance until their commander moved out of the line of fire. The image of it, the great general, surrounded by desperate soldiers grabbing his horse's bridle, pulling him back from the guns, became one of the most iconic moments of the entire war. And then, like a ghost from the west, Longstreet's corps arrived at about 7 a.m. and prevented a Confederate collapse. James Longstreet, Lee's old warhorse, the man Lee called his most reliable general. He had marched his men through the night and arrived at the exact moment they were needed. The Confederate line steadied, then it surged. Longstreet followed up with a surprise flanking attack from an unfinished railroad bed that drove Hancock's men back. The Union's best chance to break Lee wide open, gone. And then history repeated itself in the cruelest possible way. Confederate soldiers severely wounded General James Longstreet during the battle, just a few miles from where General Stonewall Jackson's troops had accidentally shot Jackson himself at Chancellorsville, almost exactly 1 year earlier. The same woods, the same terrible mistake. Friendly fire, cutting down Lee's most trusted lieutenant at the very moment of victory. The momentum was lost when Longstreet was wounded by his own men. The battle ground on. Evening attacks, flanking maneuvers, more fire, more screaming in the dark. By nightfall, both armies were essentially where they had started. When it was over, the accounting was staggering. The Union listed 2,246 killed, 12,037 wounded, and 3,383 captured or missing, a total of nearly 18,000 casualties. Confederate losses stood at roughly 11,000. The Battle of the Wilderness was the fourth bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War, behind only Gettysburg, Chickamauga, and Spotsylvania, and it had ended in a draw. Every general before Grant who had suffered a battle like this in Virginia had done the same thing, pulled back across the river, regrouped, and tried again another day. That was the pattern. That was what Lee expected. That was what the exhausted, bloodied men of the Army of the Potomac fully anticipated as they dug into their trenches on May 7th. They were wrong. That night, exhausted Federal troops left their trenches and began marching, not north, back toward the river, but south, deeper into Confederate territory. As Grant came riding to the head of the troops, the soldiers slowly realized they were not in retreat and broke into wild cheering. Grant had promised Lincoln there would be no turning back. He meant it. When asked about his intentions, Grant told a reporter headed to Washington, "Tell him, from me, that whatever happens, there will be no turning back. The Battle of the Wilderness didn't have a winner. Both sides bled. Both sides burned. Both sides buried their dead in that haunted forest and carried the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Grant himself, a man not given to overstatement, said later that more desperate fighting has not been witnessed on this continent than that of the 5th and 6th of May. But what the wilderness did produce was a turning point, not in the geography of the war, but in its psychology. For 3 years, Lee had won battles by making the Unions stop, by bleeding them until they retreated and regrouped and gave him time to recover. Grant refused to stop. And that refusal, that grinding, relentless, almost inhuman refusal to quit, is what ultimately broke the Confederacy. The wilderness didn't end the war, but it was the moment the war's ending became inevitable. The fires burned out, the smoke cleared, and 115,000 Union soldiers marched south into the dark. They didn't look back.